Good morning, friends. The last time we read Woods Runner last week, the boy Samuel was in the woods and he saw smoke and he got a really bad feeling. And when he got to his home or settlement, he found lots of people dead. He found all of their homes burned to the ground. So but he did not find his parents. So he's hoping that now he's got to come up with a plan to try to find where his parents are or where the soldiers took him. So he's alone. The Americans. Now, this is not the next chapter yet. This is just kind of the little piece of nonfiction that explains a little bit about what's going on before the chapters. The Americans. The American Army consisted of three parts: the Continental or regular Army, the Volunteer Militia, including the elite Minutemen, and the Rangers, or small groups that were trained in guerrilla tactics. The Continentals bore the brunt of the fighting, and they were equipped much like the British, with smooth-bore Brown Bess muskets and sometimes bayonets. Many of them also carried tomahawks or small hand axes, which could be very effective once past the first line, the line of bayonets. The militia volunteers were usually used to supplement the Continentals, but were quite often not as dependable or steady as they could have been had they been trained better, and they often evaporated after receiving the first volley and before the bayonets came. Most of them were also issued smooth-bore muskets, and some had bayonets for them, but others had rifles, which were very effective at long range, but could not mount bayonets. Special ranger groups, such as Morgan's Rifles, had an effect far past their numbers because of the rifles they carried. A rifle, by definition, has a series of spiral grooves down the inside of the barrel. With the low pressure of black powder, the rifling then was with a slow twist, grooved with a turn of about one rotation for 35 or 40 inches. A patched ball was gripped tightly in the bore and the grooved rifling, and the long bore up to 40 inches enabled a larger powder charge, which allowed the ball to achieve a much higher velocity. Velocity is speed, more than twice that of the smooth bores, and the high rate of rotation or spin stabilized the ball flight, resulting in greater accuracy. Chapter 5. Samuel was just 13, but he lived on a frontier where even when things were normal, someone his age was 13 going on 30. Childhood ended when it was possible to help with chores. For a healthy boy or girl, it ended at 8 or 9, possibly 10. Because of his parents' nature, their lack of physical skills, their joy in gentleness, their love of books and music, their almost childlike wonder in knowing all they could about the whole wide world, but not necessarily the world right around them, Samuel had become the provider for his family. As he embraced the forest, his skills at hunting grew. Actually, the forest embraced him, took him in, made him, as the French said, a coureur de bois, a woods runner. Soon he provided meat for nearly the whole settlement, and in turn, the other men and women helped Samuel's parents with their small farm and took over Samuel's chores when he was in the woods. Samuel's knowledge grew until when he heard a twig break, he would know whether it was a deer or a bear or a squirrel that broke it. He could look at a track and know when the animal or man made it, and whether or not the creature was in a hurry, and if so, why, and how fast it was going, and what, if anything, was chasing it, and how close the pursuer might be. The more he was of the woods, of the wild, of the green, the less he was of the people. He sometimes enjoyed being with others, and of course he loved his parents, but his skills and his woods knowledge set him apart, made him different. His neighbors in the settlement saw this, and they sought him out when they had a question about the forest or about game. They marveled at him, thought of him as kind of a seer, one who could know more than others, divine things in a spiritual way. Samuel knew this was not the case. He had just learned to see what others could not. Now he brought to the fore all his knowledge to read sign as he met the day. He was on the feet before the first light broke through the trees. He woke desperately thirsty and went to the creek that trickled past the rear of the cabin, and he drank long and hard. The water was so cold it hurt his teeth, and so sweet it took some of the taste stink from the evening before out of his mouth. He was hungry, but he could find no food that the martyrs had overlooked. He would have to shoot something along the way. For now, there was nothing to do but read sign and try to figure out what had happened, how it had happened, and exactly when. Now, read sign. That just means that he is paying attention to the woods and what's going on so that he can make judgments based on that. He started by circling the cabin, forcing himself to take time to be calm, carefully studying the ground, looking closely at the soft dirt away from the grass. First, he found small tracks for moccasins he had made from his mother. Then he saw his father's prints, also from moccasins. The right foot toed in slightly from a time when, showing off as a small boy, he'd broken his ankle jumping from a shed roof. Both sets of prints were in the soft dirt in front of the door of the cabin in the normal patterns they would make going in and out. Then, in the dirt at the side of the cabin, more moccasin prints. Larger, flatter feet, digging deeper, running as the attackers came, and still more prints, too many to tell them apart, on top of those which meant they had come later, hard shoes with leather soles and heels. At least 3 men with regular shoes, 2 of normal weight and 1 heavier. On top of all the marks, Samuel saw horse prints, 2, maybe 3 horses, all unshoed and being led. Because there was no extra weight on them, no men in the settlement wore shoes or could afford horses to ride. Only one man had a single workhorse. Others who could afford animals had oxen, because when they became too old or broken to work, they could be eaten. The attack had been fast. They had come up along the creek. Samuel backtracked and found their prints in the soft soil there, and exploded out in the clearing by the cabin. His parents were probably outside and must have been overrun with no time to react. His father wouldn't have had his musket close anyway. It was like him to leave it inside when working near the house. Samuel's father had seen bad things happen to other people, but was too good inside, too generous to believe that they could happen to him. He must believe now, Samuel thought. The attack widened rapidly. He saw where Overton and others had fallen, saw the blood now covered with flies, where they had been hacked to the ground with tomahawks. It was a mystery to Samuel, though, why his parents had not been killed. He was grateful, but it didn't make any sense. He lost their tracks as he followed the spreading attack. Larger moccasin prints and the shoe prints of the 3 men were everywhere. He could imagine the terror of the people in the settlement, the war cries of the attackers mixed with the screams of the victims and the smell of blood and fear and death. He saw where at least 2 of the men in shoes had mounted their horses. Here and there he found single or double tracks of his mother and father as they were jerked or pulled, the tracks scuffed and misshapen. New tracks joined theirs as other people were also spared, all of them dragged or pushed toward the eastern side of the settlement. Finally, he saw how it had ended. The last of the cabins were burned, the surviving victims, probably necktied to each other with rope, lined up and pulled along the trail. The horses were in front and the attackers split, some in front and some in back. There was no indication that any prisoners had been wounded or killed. When? When had it happened? He started following the tracks, which a blind man could have followed, and let his mind work on that question. He'd left home early the day before, moving west until he came to a new country, since he'd hunted out the forest around the settlement. Say by mid-morning he was out of earshot of gunfire, if anybody had used a gun. All the victims he'd buried had been chopped down with either tomahawks or war clubs. So, the attack could have come mid-morning. That would have been the soonest. If that was the case, then they were just under 24 hours ahead of him, maybe 20, 22. Moving slowly, as they would with prisoners, they might make 2 miles an hour. With a rest of perhaps 6 hours, they might have traveled 14 to 16 hours. 24 to 28 miles. He shook his head, probably less. He studied the trail ahead and the spacing of footprints, trying to estimate their speed. They were close together. Even the horses' tracks showed they were moving slowly. 20 miles at the most, yet still only a guess. But he turned out to be wrong. Later, he discovered that he'd forgotten that there was another settlement of 4 cabins 10 miles farther on, and the attackers had taken the time to stop and slaughter the people who lived there. So he was actually closer to them than he even thought originally. Okay, so for your response today, what I want you to do is I want you to make a prediction about what's gonna come next. So he's starting to find clues as to where they were, what time they were there, and how fast or close they were to him. So I want you to make a prediction about what's going to happen next. All right. Until tomorrow. Thanks, guys.